Welcome to Educators Podcast. Hi, my name is Swapnil. I work as an intensive care specialist in Sydney. And today I'm joined by another awesome simulation educator from Gold Coast, that is Professor Victoria Brazil. Welcome, Vic.
Nice to talk to you again, Swapnil.
So, Vic, we are in the midst of the pandemic and it has caused a lot of grief to a lot of people. So, first of all, how's things in Gold Coast with COVID-19?
Well, of course, we feel very fortunate that we've had nothing like the burden on the healthcare system as we thought might be happening, and nothing like what we've seen on our TV screens elsewhere. So in many ways, we're extremely grateful that we haven't had that, at least at this point. But also, to be honest, Swapnil, it's been incredibly interesting. And it doesn't mean that we haven't done a whole lot of preparation, because we have, and that in itself's been fascinating. So whatever the actual challenge, the preparation's been good. But no, people are getting back out, surfboard in one hand, flat white in the other. That's our version of Liberate marches.
That's right. And I can imagine how tough it was on Gold Coast people not to go to beach, I guess. So
yeah.
Good to hear that you're getting back to the normal lifestyle now. Now, Vic, obviously, as you mentioned, it has been interesting and you've been doing a lot of preparation in your hospital and emergency department. And obviously, simulation is your forte. And you have done a lot of work with the translational simulation. In fact, your paper in Advances in Simulation is this pretty landmark paper, I must say. So for the listeners who are not familiar with this terminology, can you just expand on this translational simulation? What does it mean?
Well, you're quite right, Swapnil. It is terminology. It's not meant to be anything more than that. But sometimes terminology is important. Words do matter. And so this refers to that subset of simulation activities that are directly focused on patient or institutional level outcomes, and focusing on those outcomes through at least two ways. One is through diagnosing system issues at the individual, team or system level, and then also seeking to address those issues through simulation. Obviously, there's plenty of other ways to do it, but this talks about doing it through simulation, whether that's through testing systems, embedding new systems, or whatever that is. The reason that I was interested in this, and the reason why I think the terminology is important, is because about the time that I wrote that paper, there was, I thought, an unhelpful debate going on about whether in-situ simulation was better than simulation center-based simulation. And I thought that was unhelpful, partly because, of course, the location is just one design aspect of something that should be much more important, which is what is it that you're trying to do. And I think simulation that's more purely education is good. And I do that kind of simulation for our medical students. But I guess this refers to the subset, which is oftentimes, but not always in situ, simulation activity that is really targeting a particular service outcome. And we're going through essentially a quality improvement cycle of studying it, planning, doing something, restudying it, acting on that. And so hence translational simulation.
Thanks for explaining that. I guess we all have done translation simulation to identify the issues in the system when we move into new buildings, new departments. And I think we found the utility of that component or that side of the simulation. Having said that, the pandemic has brought a completely different angle or aspect to this translation simulation. So can you please expand on the role of translation simulation during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, Swapnil, it's our time to shine. If ever there was a time for helping to support urgent and high-stakes change, it's been in preparation for this pandemic. And I'm very cautious to speak in the knowledge that we haven't really been tested, so I don't know if what we did has been effective for the purpose that we were doing. That doesn't mean it hasn't been interesting and there hasn't been lessons learned. So how does it help? Well, I think the first thing is to go through the process of thinking, well, what needs to change in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic? And there's no doubt with translational simulation, we don't start with a blank slate. We start with our existing processes and we have a good idea about what needs to change. And then we set about really examining the systems we've got, the teamwork process we've got, and going, is that going to suit? Let's trial some new things and then let's embed some new things. So an example I would give for us is a major trauma patient arriving at the hospital. And so we have a really good system for how that happens at the moment. But if the patient now requires certain considerations like the staff wearing PPE to protect themselves, if aerosol generating procedures are going to be performed and the room needs to be either closed or in a negative pressure room, and we might need to have new ways of communicating inside and outside the room. We might need to have different considerations about how we do our role allocation. Our pre-briefing might be different, and we may need to be more selective about the amount of equipment that we have in the room. These are really big things, and some of those things can take years to change, as you know. And the pandemic gives an urgency, which we know is important in any change management strategy, but it doesn't necessarily give us a nice template as to how to approach that change. And I think translational simulation is one of a number of strategies that we have to do, while at the same time being very cognizant that human beings haven't changed, even if the urgency and the high stakes nature of the change is there. It's still hard, and we still rise or sink to the level of our training. And so in order to facilitate teams to do something different than what they do, we actually need to really look hard at what Andrew Petrosoniak would call the friction costs, and how can we actually make it easy for people to change.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there are a lot of different key things that you mentioned about. It's translational simulation on steroid during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I really like that terminology, that simulation is also on the steroids. And as we all know, steroid can be considered as a double-edged sword. They can be very effective, but at the same time, there are harms associated with it. So what are the kind of benefits or pitfalls of translational simulation in this particular context of COVID-19?
Well, you're quite right. You have to pick your patient that's going to benefit from steroids, don't you? And I do think that when it comes to this, you want to actually have a translational simulation approach that's already embedded in your institution. And so I think just to start with, we were very fortunate to have had 5 or 6 years of working with the teams that we were going to be working with on their new systems and processes. We had an existing skill set amongst our simulation service in terms of both the quality improvement approaches as well as the technical aspects of simulation delivery in-situ with native teams. That meant that we could now just amp up some of our existing approaches. It wasn't like we were starting to do this for the first time ever and thinking, oh, I should do an airway sim because apparently you intubate a lot of COVID patients. You need to have actually already developed that relationship and that approach within the institution. So I think the first thing is this can't just be switched on when you need to prepare for a pandemic. And I think if there is one huge lesson learned, it is that we saw a big dichotomy with this of simulation facilities that were not translational or looking at systems issues often shut their doors and were regarded as not being important in this pandemic, whereas those programs that were well situated have really thrived. And I think so that's the first thing, is make sure that you've got a capability for simulation that is ready to be upscaled and directed towards the key things related to a pandemic. Because I think there are pitfalls, and the first being that most of us massively overestimate human beings' ability to change. And I don't know about you, but I've seen so many new pathways on multiple pages that are sent around in memos and emails. And, you read them and you think there is zero chance that this will happen. It's so complicated. It's so far from what we normally do. It may make pretty good sense about what we should do, but people aren't going to do it because they're not used to it. It's not part of the habit. It's not part of a reflex. And if, for instance, you want to stop doctors and nurses doing CPR on a patient until they get PPE on, you're really going to have to think hard about what's going to get in the way of them doing that, how are you going to create forcing functions, and how are you actually going to get sufficient experience in simulation or elsewhere that staff have got a new normal. And I think that's actually challenging when so many of us work on reflexes that we've built up over many years. And I think the third thing I'd just mention is that related to the pitfalls of the being on steroids is that this is already a time of great anxiety, both for the people initiating changes and for the staff who are trying to come on board with those. And I think if you just then drop in a simulation that people aren't used to, that can just heighten anxiety and illustrate just how far and how difficult the aim is from where we're usually practicing. So I do think this is not the time to stop doing really good pre-briefing. It's not the time to stop doing careful debriefing. If anything, those things become more important, even if some of the approaches might be narrower focused, even if they might be more technically focused, who knows? But there still needs to be a lot of attention to detail when it comes to preparing people for what to expect, clarity of expectations, explicit recognition of respect for people participating and helping in the process, and maintenance of that throughout the exercise.
Thanks, Vic. And I think, again, very valid thoughts. What I really liked about is, yes, you don't have to deviate from the standard practices of simulation just because you're on steroids. You still need to follow the standard of simulation that you're used to, and don't deviate from what you're doing just because you need to get things done very quickly. And sometimes we fall in that trap because everybody wants to be on that of urgency issue, and I guess there is a danger that we might skip the debriefing, we might skip the pre-briefing, and again, it's not just about running the simulation. It's actually the more value is actually in the debriefing. One of the things you mentioned about upscaling the programs, and I think most of us in Australia are lucky that most of the institutes have got simulation programs established already. So upscaling was not an issue. Obviously, starting something new for the first time is going to be an issue in most of the institutes who don't have any simulation program. Any tips for them? Because everybody's going to go through COVID-19 pandemic. If they don't have any simulation program established, what they should do?
I think that's really hard to answer, Swapnil, because I think it will depend a lot on the local context. But I do think you can do something worse than no simulation in preparation for this pandemic. I do think badly done simulation will heighten anxiety, could potentially waste time, and may actually make people even more fearful of change. So I do think no simulation is also potentially a plan. But I think ideally, as you say, most people have got some skills. And I think one of the things that I've admired in this pandemic preparation is collaboration. So it may be, for instance, that different departments have different skill sets, and this is a chance for people to share those a lot more, and also to examine those interfaces because, again, this is potentially a time when we feel like, particularly those of us in critical care, we're going to need to work together even more than usual and be able to have a lot of to and fro about where some of the traditional boundaries are drawn, about when people are transferred between different units, and indeed the skill sets. There may be anaesthetists doing ICU type activity. There might be other people in the hospital doing ED type activity. And so I do think the opportunity is also for collaboration in the simulation area, just as it is in the clinical area.
Absolutely. And I think tapping into the resources that are available in your hospital or within your area is not a bad idea if you don't have resources within your department.
Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed when I ran simulation for 3 different hospitals in Sydney is we are still working quite a lot in silos. We are doing great work. Every department is putting a lot of hard work and efforts, but still there is that silo mentality is quite obvious within most of the hospitals. Is that the same experience with you? And how do you think the translation simulation might help in that area?
Well, again, I think this is more to do with how you build your simulation capability at your institution. And we're pretty lucky in that we have the simulation service as a coordinating role, and we have people affiliated with that who are from different departments. So during the midst of our planning, we were getting together once or twice a week with people from operating theatre, ICU, the medical emergency team, after hours care unit, ED, maternity, and sort of saying, what is everyone doing? Who needs help today? What sort of sims are you doing? What other areas do you feel like we need to target? What have you learnt about communicating between different rooms? What have you learnt about disseminating through infographics? So I'd say in many ways, the simulation service for us has served as a platform for those groups not being siloed. And it has meant that we've been able to deploy particularly the more dedicated sim assets, like mannequins or whatever, to the areas as they've been needed and shared them pretty efficiently. But I realise not everyone has a hospital-wide simulation capability or outlook. And so I think, again, this is probably a reason to make sure that there is one, whether that's a networked solution or whether it's an overarching governance or whether it's simply a resource that people can draw upon. Obviously depends on how you set up things at your own institution.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. I think having the central coordination amongst the different simulation groups within the hospital it's actually probably worth thinking for the future for those hospitals who don't have that kind of role. And I agree, you're lucky in that way that you guys are doing quite a great job in terms of coordinating different departments and different aspects of patient care. Because this is probably the time where we need that coordination between different departments more than ever.
Agreed.
Now, after you ran various simulations, what are the kind of key lessons that learned through these activities?
Yeah, well, the first were some very practical considerations related to the specific context of COVID-19 and things such as how do you really clean mannequins effectively? How do you do a debrief that supports social distancing? So we had to get some little discs on the floor. We had to think about how many people could come to a simulation. We're used to having actually some pretty big crowds at our sims, things like trauma. And so suddenly we're having to say, no, you actually can't send all your people. We only want a group of 6 to 8 people involved in this simulation and debrief. And so we ended up running smaller sims more frequent, which sort of worked for our embedding process anyway. But as I said, cleaning, not bringing audio-visual equipment in, because we did quite a lot of simulation up in the COVID wards. And so, thinking about how we cleaned both the gear and the people that went in and out of there. I think all of those practical considerations were pretty important. How we didn't use up PPE stores, but still created the same challenges in terms of fake masks and other PPE simulation, as it were, so that we still had the challenge there, but not obviously using real PPE. So I guess there were a number of practical lessons like that were probably useful to go through the exercise of. The second thing was, I think, in my mind anyway, it's certainly been a chance to refine some of the thinking around translational simulation, and very grateful for some of the writing that's been done in the meantime by people like Nora Coleman, and Sue Barnes in their paper about systems testing, and also the work of Andrew Petrosoniak about design thinking in sim. And I think we certainly recognised these phases of the simulation. So yes, it was iterative, but even within those iterative cycles, there was definitely a sort of planning, brainstorming stage. Then there was a testing out of ideas stage. And then we got to a close enough to be good enough. And then we really moved into an embedding phase where we're saying now we're just going to get small teams to really train towards this process. So I think that was really useful to me to say, well, we could probably refine the approach, as it were, for this particular thing to look at different phases. So they were probably some of the lessons learned. The other lessons learned were, again, just there's always a relational and affective element as you proceed with any of these things. There are groups who are culturally more comfortable with change, with followership, and then there's groups who aren't, and a different approach that recognises that maybe a different tack in the pre-briefing, the debriefing, and a different point in their phase. So I think it just reinforced for me the need to be very attuned to the group that you're working with and what's going to be helpful for them at that time. Sometimes they know what that is. Sometimes it's just better known by someone who's coming in from outside, to be perfectly honest. And so I think that requires a lot of sensitivity and still make mistakes. And then finally, it makes you sort of think, well, how do you come back out of it? Because that's probably one of the most interesting things for us at the moment, is how do we take that same agility and flexibility that we took into this, being able to rapidly do a large number of sims, and now move back out towards the kind of processes we had, but maybe still hang on to some of the things that we changed because, in fact, they're better. And one of the biggest comments that I heard as we went around the hospital doing things was, why don't we do it like this all the time? So there's some things we don't want to do post-pandemic, but there's some things that maybe we've streamlined very nicely that are useful to us. And I think hopefully we can select out some of those and retain them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good comment. And you kind of touched upon two key issues during the simulation. One is the PP burn rate, because we don't want to burn all the PP that we got. This is really a valuable resource during this pandemic, but you have to train people how to use PP at the same time during using simulation. There's a kind of lot of challenges there. And the second one is the educator burnout, because you're doing number of simulations in a very short period of time, and almost you're on steroids in a way, and you are at risk of burnout. So how did you tackle those two issues?
I'll take the second one first. It wasn't really like being on steroids. It was like being on amphetamines or something. You're right. These were very, very busy 4 weeks. And I think it is important to look at the own journey of your own adrenaline and sustainability of your team. And again, we've got a pretty large team and groups who are able to sub in and out. We had people who were doing clinical shifts as well. So I think we ended up having a reasonable balance, but you're right. I was glad we weren't doing it for another 4 weeks, because I think that would have just about seen the end of us. And also the learners, I think, get a little bit of fatigue. So there's a balance there. As to your first question about the PPE, so we had a combination of mental rehearsal as well as some physical fake PPE. So when teams were getting ready to do whatever they did and they need to put on PPE, we would make them talk through every piece of PPE they would put on. But in fact, they only ended up wearing a white apron, some fake paper napkins that had elastic bands for things that our simulated patients had made for us, and a pair of gloves. So we still had some of the, goggles, which we could reuse, clean and reuse. So we still had some of the barriers to high performance in terms of communication, vision, and other things, but we didn't actually use any real PPE in terms of yellow gowns or N95 masks or anything like that, because that was, we decided, not acceptable. But we made people talk through every single step as they did that, so that it was a form of mental rehearsal in both donning and doffing.
Okay, so that's kind of innovative approach there, I guess. Now, COVID-19 has challenged educators' ability to deliver the simulation as a pedagogy, because as you mentioned, we can't get a lot of people in the room. There is always risk that if one person is infected, that means everybody has to go in quarantine. And there's a lot of risks in that kind of approach, where even getting 5 to 6 people around mannequin is risky. And then, as you mentioned, you have to clean the mannequin and all those things. So you mentioned about the small group strategies that you utilize, but are there any other ways to mitigate some of the risk?
Look, I think you've got to be pretty convinced that, like everything, the risk and benefit is there. So I think you can say, yes, there is a risk in small groups getting together for simulation, but there is a benefit in that you can't not train for this challenge. I don't think, though, you can say that the risk of 25 medical students getting together to learn about something for a purely educational purpose in the short term is worth it. So again, I think this just involves a rigorous decision about what can happen during this time and what can't. So for instance, we had cancelled our faculty development. We cancelled the things that I think weren't immediately needed in favour of things that were training towards this specific challenge. But in terms of what that means for the educational approach coming out of it, well, I guess we wait and hear about what's allowed with the social distancing, but we've certainly reintroduced some things that can still conform to the, 2 meters and having smaller groups in a room. And so we will be restarting some of our faculty development, and we'll be restarting some of our more departmentally based educational sims, but still in very small groups, and so that we hopefully avoid the kind of thing that you're talking about. And obviously, we hope that the community transmission gets to the point where we can stop thinking about it. But I actually think Swapnil, it's been a little bit of a gift because it just makes us think really hard about the benefit of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that's always a nice little exercise, I think, to take ourselves through. And if we can't justify it in a pandemic, then we better make sure that it is justifiable outside of it.
Yeah, and I agree. We have to ask that question why and justify all the time what are we doing, especially in COVID-19, when we are a very precious resource as a healthcare professional. We have to be very careful on what are we kind of up to. And I was very cautious, to be honest, to start with, even to get into the simulation as a participant or as a faculty, because am I going to acquire COVID-19 through some other contacts? But I guess you're right. The benefits outweigh the risks. And then I guess that there is a worth doing this exercise quite regularly with a small number of people in it.
Yeah, I think one of the other things it probably shines a light on is the modality. So we, at a certain point, stopped taking our 3G SIM over and used much lower fidelity mannequins that we could leave in a space that we weren't transporting around the hospital, again, just purely for good infection control type reasons. And probably we should do that a little more often anyway.
Yeah, that's right. And it comes back to what are your learning objectives? And I guess you can tailor your whole simulation and modalities according to your learning objectives. And most of the times we don't need a mannequin to run or achieve our learning objectives. So yeah, I think this pandemic has actually forced us to think quite harder about how we are delivering the simulation and what are we using it for, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think you mentioned in one of the answers, and I think this is always a dilemma for a lot of educators out there, that how to assess the impact of your intervention. And especially when you're on steroids, you don't have much time to design any kind of research question or assessment process. How did you manage that challenge, and what things you did at Gold Coast to assess the impact of your activities?
Yeah, so probably I would use, just for a little bit of semantics, I would use the term evaluation rather than assessment there. But I think that's really hard, because clearly the success of this might have been that we didn't actually need to use any of those skills, and that's our public health heroes and various others who've done such a brilliant job. And just because we didn't put those things into practice, does that mean that our simulation effort was wasted? I don't think so, because I think we've learned a lot just about rapid high stakes change. How do we know if what we did was the right thing? I don't think we ever will. I think we can get some participant reflections. I think we can get some leadership reflections. I think we can get some hard ideas about the volume of simulation we managed to do and what areas we managed to target. I don't think doing a large-scale survey of everybody about what they think is necessarily going to help us know if we did the right thing. So I think we have to have an intense period of reflection ourselves, and to share that also with our clinical leadership and see if they felt like this hit the mark with what they wanted. But ultimately, I think we've just got to make sure that we do identify what those lessons were and don't just rapidly forget them as COVID goes away. Indeed it does. But actually take a bit of commitment to cement them. So I haven't really answered your question as in how do I rate us on a 1 to 10? I don't think I can. But I think I don't feel the huge need to, because I do think we've got lots of ways of gathering some ideas about how we should shape our response in the future.
Oh, okay. No, I agree with you. And I guess there's no right or wrong answer. And probably most of us still struggling with this idea about how to get it right in the first place. And we need to do enough volume to start with to then kind of formulate a research question. Now, one of the participants in your simulation mentioned that why can't we do things the same way every time? Do you think that this pandemic will change our approaches towards the education in the long term, and we might start doing things quite differently than before COVID-19 era?
I hope that we do. My fear is that we won't. But I don't know. I've not been through a time like this. It's pretty unique, isn't it, Swapnil? For instance, I think what we've seen here provides a very compelling reason for our medical students to work much more as apprentices in a health system, when we could then afford to give them PPE because they'd be doing a useful job, and we could actually have a parallel process of education with work. And, I think that might seem like a very radical idea, but what we've seen over the last 8 weeks suggests to me that we could position medical students very differently within the health services, both during their training and afterwards. What does it mean for simulation? I think it's a great call to make sure that health institutions and health services have got a translational simulation capability, amongst other skill sets in rapid change. But I think for me, anyone who didn't have this should be looking hard and thinking, how could I be ready to respond with a process that involves idea generation, rapid prototyping, testing, and embedding, that is much more than merely educating. I hope that it also means that we recognise the value of specific training in the face of these sorts of challenges. There's a great temptation when we're busy clinically to say all education must be cancelled, but that was so totally the wrong thing here, given what we were up against, that you instead needed to be educating from dawn till dusk instead, because of the difficulty of trying to make changes to what we normally did. So I think to recognise that education has to serve those clinical priorities, whether it's SIM or otherwise, and that that means it needs to be accommodated within any preparation process rather than discarded in favour of work.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we have to start thinking out of the box now, and in order to kind of be ready for something like that in future, because I think this time it clearly showed that we were not ready purely from the education point of view to deal with the challenges, because we all are clinicians. We do our clinical shifts, but at the same time we do education. And in a normal circumstances, we are busy people, emergency, critical care, ICU, anesthesia, all critical care services, including physicians. We all are busy. But we never thought about that something that will change the education's domain this much. And you're right, this is probably the high time where we should be investing more in education rather than saying, let's close the education activities and let's focus on the clinical activities only, because clearly there are a lot of negative implications with that approach. A lot of the places moved education online, and it's very easy to do with the technology nowadays. But clearly, the translation simulation is a missing piece, and really you can't do that effectively online, and you still need a lot of engagement and a lot of planning and processing. But moving forward, do you think the online space or the virtual reality and augmented reality will take over the simulation activities that we normally do in simulation lab or in-situ simulation?
Short answer, no. Longer answer, obviously it depends what it is that we're trying to achieve. There are some things that virtual simulation will be able to achieve really well for us. There's some things like small group learning that we can actually do over a video conference. One of the things that I feel we do, for instance, with our student simulation is integrate domains of practice. So having to do clinical reasoning at the same time as communicating with the patient, at the same time as working with a member of nursing staff and someone else, at the same time dealing with the things in the clinical environment like monitors and documentation charts. And unfortunately, to recreate that level of complexity in a virtual simulation is, at least at present, way beyond our consumer level technology. So I think that kind of integrated team-based scenario work is going to be not able to be replaced anytime soon by a virtual or tele-simulation. Does that mean you can't practice various elements of that performance? Of course not. I think there's plenty of things we can do virtually and via simulation. And the folks at Sim1 in Canada just produced a lovely framework for looking at what simulation formats suit what kind of learning outcomes, I think prompted by exactly the question that you're asking, Swapnil. And so I think we should really be thinking hard back to our educational principles. What is it that we're trying to achieve? It's communicating with a patient. That can happen really nicely over a video link, or even now some really excellent avatar-based software that people have got. If you want to practice clinical reasoning, then you can actually have online cases and case discussions, and that's really good for clinical reasoning. But I do think just as any simulation is not quite the same as real clinical work, the more you move away from the formats that are closer to the clinical environment, the harder it is to capture the integrated performance. So again, it depends.
That's right. It depends on a lot of things. Also, this COVID-19 pandemic, in a way, it's kind of paradoxical, but has provided a lot of funding opportunities in a lot of sectors. And there is a possibility of collaboration between the private sector and the health sector or the education sector. What's your take on that, and how we should kind of take advantage of COVID-19?
Look, it's hard to know that obviously governments and health services put various incentives in place at times of crisis to try and mitigate those things. It's hard to know whether that's a real funding opportunity or whether it's money that's not sustainable. I think collaboration is often a good thing, but you want to make sure that it's founded on something that really has a sort of long-term prospect. It's easy to make a cunning plan now, but if it's, obsolete in 6 weeks' time, it's probably not worth the investment in a collaboration, which takes a lot of work. That said, I do think that often these crises throw opportunities our way, and we should definitely look at all of them, embrace some of them, but also have a little bit of wisdom to know when there might be a reason to be selective.
Yeah, I think that's a very wise advice. Now, there are a lot of educators who are listening who are in a probably different stages of pandemic. What's your advice to those educators?
I really would hesitate to give advice to any of our colleagues who are now living through what seems a most intense challenge. And I will be very interested to hear from them what they think would have helped them when the dust has settled. I think that'll be incredibly informative to us. I think maybe it's a reminder yet again, though, of particularly for those of us in critical care, to be honest, our impact on the health of our communities is tiny compared to these public health things. And I hope that one of the things we take away is what can we actually do as a simulation community to work further forwards, shall we say, in the sequence of care for patients, and not just be spending all the time we have on practicing intubating COVID patients when we could have actually spent a lot of time preparing many more people for the public health messages, either as a community or as a health service, or training people to be really good at contact tracing and all those other things. And I've seen some work on computer modelling and simulation that has, I think, been incredibly helpful in planning for this. So I hope there's also a reminder about the marginal benefit we get from critical care simulation, and make sure that we're also focusing on some of the things that might prevent patients getting in front of us in the first place.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I completely agree that COVID-19 is not just about intubating COVID patient simulations. There are a lot of different aspects to simulation during this pandemic. And I think as a simulation educator, you really need to broaden your horizons and think widely. How can you address all those issues of pandemic management? And I think that's really valuable advice. So thanks, Vic. It's a pleasure to have you again on the show.
Thank you, Swapnil. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And best wishes and congratulations on the Educators podcast so far.
Thanks, Vic.